These are a collection of Reddit stories of people spilling dark family secrets. I grew up with a girl down the street who lived with her mom and stepdad. Stepdad was pretty cool, according to 7-year-old me. Nice guy. Come to find out, he'd been raping my friend for years. It had been going on so long, had been so normalized to her, that she thought I was doing that with my dad, and our other friend was doing it with her dad. To her, your father figure having sex with you was just something you did. I was too young to know what happened at the time it was discovered, but I do remember my mom asking me if he had ever touched me and her being very concerned he might have hurt me. Was years before I found out what actually happened. I know a brother and sister, live together in a huge mansion and both own amazing beautiful cars, clearly very affluent. One of them began dating a family friend who wasn't so well off. Turns out the reason they're so rich is because their parents were associated with some Italian mafia, and were brutally murdered and raped in front of them when they were children. They were given a huge inheritance after this event. You would never guess, they look like they've had the easiest life. Edit, since everyone's asking, the mother was raped, then murdered while her husband watched, then the husband was murdered. Poor choice of syntax, my bad. My sister and I both got UTIs at the same time when our family was staying at our grandparents' house. One day my grandma took both of us aside and started what felt like an interrogation about whether any adults had touched us. Like, if something happened, you have to tell me right now. At the time, I felt gross, confused, and guilty, even though nothing had happened. It was just too intense. I later learned that my grandma had been sexually abused by her brother for years and her mother refused to believe her. A family my girl had known her whole life had a similar situation with a brother molesting their young daughter. The mom had brought it up in conversation like it was nothing and seemed normal to her. It wasn't normal to me. I felt guilty for many years since literally ripped their family apart, but we reported it to CPS the next day. Long story short, the daughter was removed from home and adopted to a new loving family. The son went to juvenile detention and just recently got out when he turned 18. The mom did jail time and is now a felon. The dad lost all rights to both kids and just vanished. I know I did the right thing and the little girl has a way better life now, but it's a lot knowing you changed so many people's lives for the best, but in the worst way. Edit, didn't expect to get so much kind words and feedback. Thanks to everyone who shared their own story, takes a lot of courage, you all are the real ones who really deserve the gold. My grandpa burned to death. I found out he died when I was a kid, but was not allowed to go to his funeral, and they told me he had a heart attack. I was so confused because everyone around me would clam up when I asked about him. Turns out that he had a heart attack while trying to put out a field fire, collapsed, and burned. I still have no idea how long it took for people to find him, but I'm assuming it was hours. When I was around 6 to 8 years old, my uncle passed away. I thought it was something sudden and medically tragic, as I remember him having lung problems of some sort. When I got older I found out he committed suicide, because his girlfriend broke up with him. I remember visiting my dad and hanging out in my uncle's room where we got to play video games and listen to cool music with him. That was the start of me learning about mental illness running in the family and connected a lot of dots for me. My grandmother's husband was a pedophile. All of a sudden I knew why my uncle was so weird and would pick me up and carry me away rather than let me stay alone in a room with him. For the longest time I thought my uncle was a real prude. My male cousins could all swim naked or run around in just their swim trunks, but my uncle made me always wear a swimsuit and put on a cover-up when I came out of the pool. He later admitted if God forbid he touched you, I was making sure no one could try to blame you. They blamed all his other victims for being too tempting. My uncle, bless his heart, wanted to kill that man so bad. For that matter, so did my dad. Finding out the pedo was, well, a pedo, made all of their muttering to each other at family gatherings make so much more sense. My dad never called his stepmom anything but her real name, Margaret. He has 7 brothers and sisters and they all called her mom or some form of that. When I got older, it turns out my grandpa was actually cheating on my real grandma, my dad's mom, with Margaret while she was dying for colon cancer. My dad was 5 when she dies, and as she was dying my dad had to call my grandpa to tell him to come home because she was dying. After that, Margaret and her 3 kids moved in and my dad was forced to live with a sister who was 18 and married. This was late 70s back country, so not abnormal for the time, from then until he turned 16 when he decided to move in with his best friend and his mom. So I learned that he probably has always had resentment towards Margaret because of everything that happened when he was so young, and never wanted to call her anything that resembled a mother because that's not what she was to him. My father always talked about how his brother lied to a doctor so he could get on disability. I thought it was so easy for anyone to get a disability check, all you had to do was tell your doctor you were abducted by aliens. Years later, my father had a mental breakdown. He started telling stories about the government implanting a chip in his brain. He went out and got a CAT scan as proof, and he would point to things that weren't there. My dad was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and years later, he started collecting a disability check because he couldn't hold a job. Kind of hard to perform any job when every conversation, including interviews, veers into the government trying to fuck me in the ass. As an adult, it dawned on me when my aunt mentioned mental illness runs in the family. My uncle had never lied to his doctor. He told that doctor what he believed to be the absolute truth: he had been abducted by aliens. Mom's side, I found this out right before a family reunion where we tried to trace back our lineage as far as it would go. A guy way back in the early 1800s married his wife. She died. He then married her sister. She died. He then married their mother. That's the couple that continued my branch of the family tree. The guy had brand loyalty. Dad's side, the reason my family left the East Coast is because an older relative in the early 1900s murdered a man in front of the entire town. My biological grandmother kidnapped my dad when he was like 6 or so. She took him to Key West and they lived there for a year. Dad's surprisingly good memories of the time: he had a nice dog and a pet octopus. Then the police found them. While waiting for my grandfather to come get them, my 7-year-old dad and his 9-year-old brother were tossed into a holding cell with a teenager who was later convicted of drowning his best friend on a golf course. Also, my bio-grandma ran away with a race car driver. The driver's wife and my grandpa were looking for their wayward spouses, and when they found them, served them divorce papers and married each other. All this came out when I asked why my dad always called my grandmother by her real name instead of Mom. I think I was 10. Fun stuff. My paternal grandfather's parents were somewhat of a mystery. He basically said that his parents died when he was little, and that's about all we could get out of him. His dad did die, but his mother was very much alive for quite some time, although I have absolutely zero idea as to what happened to her in the end. For all I know, she could still be alive now. I found an article from 70+ years ago when I looked my great-grandfather up. He and his wife were hit by a drunk driver while they were walking. She survived, but he died at the scene. She and my grandpa, who was 2 at the time of the accident, were on their own for a while before she abandoned him in a boarding house. He told us that part last year. My aunt hid her first pregnancy from everyone. She was a teenager at the time and her plan was to have the baby in the woods and then bury it. One snowy winter day my mom heard my aunt singing Christmas songs in the woods. Mom literally walked up on my aunt in the middle of the woods singing Christmas songs while pushing out the baby. My mom ran and got her parents. The Christmas songs was to distract her from the pain. Turns out my aunt was raped and my grandparents ended up raising the baby as their own to try to avoid scandal. It was a huge deal to have a baby out of wedlock in eastern Kentucky in those days. Plus my grandfather was deep into politics and could not have it smear his family name. My aunt was so scared of what would happen she planned to kill the baby. That baby is now an adult with children of his own and has no clue what his mom's birthing plan was. My mom told me this and swore me to secrecy. Not everyone in my family knows. I found out a couple of years ago that our family is connected to the mafia. My dad, however, isn't in that life. He is a legitimate businessman and always stayed out of that life. I found out the dark secret when I wasn't allowed to go hang out or go party casually just like everybody else. Our family was always surrounded by bodyguards because my dad was worried all the time. We were moving to new places and countries every year just to stay out of trouble. My dad's business took a hit when the feds raided his office when they were performing a sweep on the mob guys. My dad had no connection, but his side of the family was, so the feds never really left us alone. My mom was so done with this whole thing, so she made it clear to the dad's side of the family that we want no part of this and to leave us out of trouble. Because of my dad's last name, he had trouble getting into business with others, as none of them wanted to get involved with him. I promised I would never tell anyone, and she told me to take this to my grave, but if we're being honest, if I don't get this out somehow I'll just never be able to keep the secret forever. So I'm just gonna write this out here as a way of taking the weight off of me a bit. Anyways, my parents got divorced around a year ago. My mother was a mess, and I was in the middle of it because my parents were both coming to me for relationship advice, just to rant, whatever. I'm also the one who originally told my dad to leave, so there's that too. Anyways, after he left the fourth time, she broke down and started talking about all she put up with and had to endure during their marriage. She talked about how frequently he would leave us, for weeks at a time, and how she would struggle to get food for us. This was when he was an alcoholic, so I was a tad too young to remember. Then, she mentioned that she had been raped. Apparently, while we were in the house. And it was just really disturbing to hear. It wasn't my father who did it, just to clarify. But it did happen during one of those times when he had left us, so she couldn't help but blame him for not being there. Apparently, the guy was a felon that had moved in next door. He came over one day asking to borrow some tools, and she was doing some harmless flirting, when he forced himself on her. She never called the cops because she blamed herself, and I'm really worried about the psychological aspects of that, as well. It is notable that the guy did eventually go to prison for a completely unrelated charge, and we don't know anything about him anymore. Anyways, that's it, just needed to get it off my chest. My brother has sexually molested and assaulted numerous girls at my mom's home daycare. I watched him assault girls who were as young as 2. He was 15. That girl I'm pretty sure now has a mental disability due to the traumatic shock. He did it almost every day. Unless he was at some sort of sports practice. Some girl finally told her school and the cops were called. My mom knew, she ran the daycare. She called the girls' parents and threatened to take them to court and saying she would sue. I think she was just scared of our secret getting out and ruining the daycare. We live in a small town. I'm pretty sure my brother is a rapist now. Not me, but a friend's story.